Okay, we're live and recording. Welcome to the Blind Tasting Workshop Class 4. Again, I'm Laura Fiorvanti. I'm pleased to be with you for the final class of the workshop, but hopefully not the final time we're going to blind taste together. And blind tasting has been really fun with you because I think I see so much growth in your comments and your emails that you send to me. Just like these intelligent conversations about wine, which is really, at the end of the day, why we want to blind taste. We want to be more mindful. We want to have an ability to really enjoy the great wines we're tasting. And so, while maybe some people do it for passing exams, some people do it to do competition, some people are doing it because they want to write about wine and they want to have no preconceived notions about grapes or regions. I find really just straight up having fun with blind tasting is the real reason to do it. So with that said, I had a couple of questions I wanted to share with the group from the last few weeks. One that we were asking about last week, someone in the chat was asking about what we thought. He wrote brettanomyces, and I explained it, but we're going to talk about that in further detail today. But what he meant to say, which he realized after the fact, it was a long week, was he was curious about botrytis in wine and how you tell the difference between botrytis and warmth in a vintage, which I thought was a brilliant question. And my answer reminded me that this is not the case just in this example, but this is the case in a lot of examples, that there are always going to be overlaps, messages coming through to you in a glass of wine that can come from one reason or a very similar reason. And it's up to us to take the information and then deduce or prove why that information is true. So let's talk about this example. He meant botrytis in wine from class 2 with the Hertzberger Gruner Veltliner, remember that wine, Smaragd. How can you tell the difference between that botrytis and warmth in a vintage? So for example, he missed botrytis and just thought it was a warm wine region. And so when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense, right? Botrytis gives you characteristics of sun-dried fruit. So botrytis gives you orange marmalade. Botrytis gives you that honey. And in our case of that wine, it was almost like, how do we know if it's honey or honeysuckle? And so remember that a couple of things were happening for the message of botrytis. The smell and the taste were definitely happening, and the smell can happen in a warm wine region, right? You can have sun-drenched dried fruit. You can just have a California Chardonnay in a warm climate where it smells like dried mangoes and papaya or banana. And so you can get some of the dried fruit in botrytis. But in botrytis, you start seeing it from the beginning. You start seeing it with that dark, deep color. So you look at a wine that has dark, deep color, and you smell it, and it's not from oak, and it's not from oxidation. So you're like, wait a minute. How is this wine young smelling, but looks old, but doesn't have oak? So first message is saying, well, one of the things that happens is botrytis does that. So you might say from the beginning that botrytis was showing its face. The second thing, of course, even though we got the dried fruit, but we also had that almost saffron ginger, I hate to say mushroomy, moldy smell, but botrytis is a type of rot. So you get an earthiness in the warmth as well. And if we looked at a warm climate, there is something that was there in a warm climate that we did not get, which is we would have elevated alcohol. We would have high alcohol in order to get such tropical fruits. So I guess what I'm saying is it's a brilliant question because those two things really do show up in a similar way. But that's why we almost always have to say, is everything right for this question query, right? And so I wanted to talk about things that show up like that, where you can confuse one for the other. We talked a little bit about this, but sometimes we smell Chablis, for example. And, Chablis is an unoaked white wine that has the characteristic, of course, it's Chardonnay, and it has this characteristic like a chalky, organic earth, a mushroomy, kind of cheesy quality to it. And sometimes it can have a lees, right? It can smell like lees aging. Same with Muscadet and same with Albarino, right? It can have almost like this chive. I always used to say sour cream and onion potato. Like that's the smell of lees. And once in a while, we can smell Sancerre, which is the smell of pyrazine, right? The green aroma we talked about, I think 2 weeks ago or last week. And we can confuse lees, the cheesy sour cream smell, with a smell of green pyrazine. So you can take a wine like Sancerre and mistake it for Chablis, or you can, more common, mistake a Chablis and call it Sancerre because you're like, I get this green element. So what is the difference between those two? Well, grape, right? Because the grape itself, well, you have to say, well, this Sancerre, if you were blind tasting Sancerre and you got green, you would also get a lot of those thiols, those smells of grapefruit and exotic smells. And Chardonnay is just a neutral grape. You never get that. You almost always get the apple and the pear, but not really. So I guess, another example, which would be a really good one, is to think about American oak smell. I don't know that we've talked about that often, but this is something intriguing to me. American oak, you've probably been told, has a much more pungent oak taste. Maybe we sometimes describe it as coconut or dill, or a good reference is bourbon, because bourbon by law has to be aged in American oak. So we have this sweet molasses taste and smell. And you can confuse American oak with, Cabernet Franc, with a bell pepper smell, because you're getting this strong sense of dill. Or you can confuse that American oak smell because it's so sweet with New World, like, oh, this wine is really ripe fruit, but really it's the oak use. So I just thought that was really cool. And the another question / query comment was about the Gewürztraminer from last week. Someone was asking about the bitterness, sort of the feeling of the pulling of the skin of Gewürztraminer, and it is quite, I don't want to say thick, but it definitely has a much richer skin to juice ratio in Gewürztraminer, and you do get like almost like the feeling of a bitterness, like when you chew a grape skin. You've all probably had table grapes, and sometimes they have like a bitterness to the skin. So there definitely was some phenolic bitterness. And phenolic bitterness is something, there's a couple of grapes that you really show phenolic bitterness where, it's a white grape, but how it reminds you of tannin. It just sort of pulls on your tongue and on your gums. So hopefully that helps. But I'm excited about these wines. They're amazing. I wanted to do something that I hope you do in life going forward, relays. Probably some of you ran marathons, right? I ran a marathon in 2010, and you train in very different ways. Sometimes you do long runs, sometimes you do hills, sometimes you do sprints. So in wine and blind tasting, some things that I like to do is, of course, taste with the grid. So basically just go through appearance, nose, palate, initial, final. And sometimes I like to do these little relay races. So If you have the two wines that we sent you, especially because they're red, both red, it'll be really fun to do the relay race of the following. I'm going to ask you a series of questions to ask yourselves before we go through the lesson and before we go through the blind tasting. So I have both of my wines here with me. Hopefully you do too. And first I'm going to ask you if you had to pick one of the wines that was garnet, more garnet in color, which one would be more garnet? So sometimes we have a trouble in the world of wine with garnet versus ruby. And I don't know that anyone ever feels comfortable asking. So which one is more garnet, Josh?
The first one.
Yes. Yes. And okay, remember we were talking about color, wine losing its color over time. So, Josh, when I see this garnet color, that's like, this is the core of the color. This is not just like a hint of garnet or a shade of garnet around the rim. This is like almost the entire picture of the color is garnet, right? Now I want everyone to go ahead and smell it. And in the realm of garnet coming from age or garnet being something we get else from other things, does it smell like a wine? In order to get this much garnet that it becomes the entire color, it would have to be probably 10 to 15 years old. Does it smell that old? Yeah.
No, it doesn't.
Right, exactly. In Richie's crew, I see them nodding no. Exactly. So we have, this is what I was talking about with the botrytis. And we're not trying to guess. Please don't guess. That's not the point. But what we're trying to do is say immediately when we see things, what's our next question to ourselves? Okay, so then in terms of the color of wine 2, what would you say is the core color? And so how do we define the difference between the two colors? So I'm looking at the core color. Would you say it's opaque or would you say it's a little more transparent?
Okay.
Opaque, right. So this is a really good example why we picked them of a wine that is what we could call a thick skin grape with wine number 2, slightly thicker skin. Certainly it's not ink and it's not like deep like purple, but this is the thick skin versus a relatively thin skin grape. So when I look at wine number 1, I also see a slight hazy quality to it. So what I'm looking at, this is likely, if you all remember with wine number 1, unfined, unfiltered. So not that it's better or worse, but we're seeing this haze. So that's our first relay. Our second relay, which we're going to do, is I'm only going to focus you guys on acid. So what I want you to do is I want you to take a sip of wine 1 and take a sip of wine 2. And as it relates to acid, try to disconnect every single thing else. Don't try to guess. Don't try to think about the smells. Tell me which one is higher acid. And when you figure out which one is higher, rate the acid of low through high of both of them. So first we're going to taste just for acidity. Reminding you to think about the way your mouth starts producing moisture. I'm going to ask you also to disconnect the tannin for a second. So I know this is hard, but imagine you're tasting the wine and you're focusing on the way your gums start to salivate. And you pause before you think about your mouth drying. Do that for both of the wines. Okay, tell me which one is higher acid.
Wine number 1.
Yes, definitively higher acid. And a lot of people have trouble their high hat on. They have trouble saying high and they have trouble saying low. So a lot of times we just go to medium plus. Tell me, is the acid high, medium plus, or medium? And wine 1.
So for me, I would have gone to that medium plus right away. But I think, I know we're not supposed to be talking about it, but I think because of that, the tannins that come right in immediately after, I feel like it might be decreasing our perception of the acid.
Because
So it may be higher than what we're actually perceiving. So it may be high.
it's exactly the conversation I want to have. There's a circle happening. It's not actually a shape of a circle, but there's something happening because one is making your mouth do the opposite of the other. So actually, sometimes if you look at the wine in between the two components, it's almost like you don't see either of them. So I'll explain. For those of you that even are not tasting these wines, once we reveal them, you can do this at home with the next bottle that is this type of wine. But the acid in wine 1 is high. And yes, I didn't ask for it yet, but the tannin is also high. It's okay, Kelly. I wanted to have this conversation because I want to do that next, the relay of tannin. But the tannin is high and the acid is high. So we know that acid makes the salivation, our mouth, the pH in our mouth lowers, our mouth dilutes it, and we start salivating to save our gums, right? My joke. So as soon as your mouth produces moisture, by that time, the tannin in the wine, if the wine is tannic, will start to take the moisture out of your mouth. So like, if you're not focusing just on acid and you're just focusing on the totality of the wine, you're like, oh, okay, the wine, wait, my mouth is dry, it can't be high acid. So it's because the two are high that you almost can't tell that the other one is extreme. So let's just talk for a second about acid in wine 2. What do you think the acid here is? Something that might help you is to think about last week's class of the condition of the fruit. I think about that statement. If I had to describe this wine to someone that couldn't taste the wine, would I say that the fruit was perfectly ripe, underripe, or overripe? And so, what type of fruit are we looking at? We're looking at red and black plums. Probably a little more red than black, but there's definitely black there as well. And the plum is borderline almost ripe. It's not overripe, but it's like it's almost ripe, you know? So between slightly underripe and overripe plum. The acid's about medium plus. You guys feel acid medium plus? Now, of course, you could imagine after coming off of wine number 1, your mouth is like a little bit of an assault.
Yeah.
Wine tasting, sometimes in my exams, I would smell them first and decide if I had to take something out of order, because there's definitely something to your mouth feeling a certain way and then going to the next wine and maybe not being able to separate them. But with wine number 2, you probably noticed the tannins are what? The tannins are not, what would you call the tannins on wine 2?
Medium to medium plus.
Yes, thank you. I would say medium. And so if you had to describe the structure of wine 2, you would probably say, I have a medium plus acid wine with roughly medium tannin. I mean, you could make a case for medium plus tannin, but it's not really that high. So, and the tongue on my actual gums, I don't feel the tannin as high. Now, this is really something that I've struggled with for a long time, how to tell acid from tannin, you know, and sometimes they're really just like so woven around each other, but I wanted to show you that. So with wine number 1, high, with wine number 2, medium plus, and you could even argue between medium and medium plus tannin. So with that said, we kind of have like the bones of the structure of the wine. What do you think the alcohol, if you had to just smell them, do this for me, smell them and taste and feel the alcohol as like either something in your chest or between your nose. Wine number one is somewhat deceiving. I want to know what you think the alcohol is. And you might tell yourself this sometimes, you have to forget everything else. Forget the color, forget the tannin. Actually think about alcohol. So for me,
I feel like wine 2 has more alcohol, but wine 1 has a longer finish.
interesting. Maybe. I think wine number one.
I think wine number one is high alcohol.
Yeah. You know, it's deceiving, right? I don't know your name because you're with Richie, but you're right. It's so deceiving. You smell it. And
Yeah, see the legs too. They're very, I mean, the viscosity is high.
Wait, yeah, it is. I'm sitting here staring at this beautiful glass of wine with wine number one, and I'm allowing the tears to come down, but I don't even have to swirl it. They're just literally falling down the side of the glass. So it's actually amazing because we often feel as heavy, right? The wines that I know that I have high alcohol, Amarone, Napa Valley Cab, right, for reds, Amarone, Napa Valley Cab, Aussie Shiraz, and they're so dark and they're so deep and they're so intense that my mind goes, this is a light wine. Look at it. It's so garnet, like Josh said, it looks like we could read through it. Oh, and I just automatically go, no, that's not high alcohol. That's the whole point of these little mini exercises, is that you might have not picked it up, but if you smell it, it's kind of like smelling Vicks Vapor Rub in a way, in a good way, by the way, but you get it right here. So sometimes you get alcohol as a smell in between your nose. So I feel like I can almost smell. This is probably like, it's not high in the realm of like 16%, but I would imagine, these days 14 would be there. And wine number three or wine number two is probably medium plus alcohol. We'll look at the actual percentages after. But with that said, that's the rest of our relay. Now we're going to talk about oak, and we're going to think about the smell of new oak, old oak, used oak, large oak. And as it relates to these wines, if one of them or both of them have use of oak, is it old or is it new? And do you think it's large or do you think it's small barrel? So reminding us how we can tell. The smell of new oak is very sweet. And that's another mistaken, sometimes we think we smell a lot of oak and we associate it with warm climates. We smell, by the way, Pinot Noir, because it's a grape that adapts to its environment, and it's so like a grape that has an ability to wear whatever the winemaker does. Often Pinot Noir will smell, when it's aged in new oak, really sweet. So it almost like shows oak much more. It seems like it's higher oak than it is, but new oak, it's vanilla, cinnamon, nutmeg, clove. Old oak smells slightly musty, as if, something was dried and wet and dry over and over again, but also allows oxygen exchange. So you'll smell earthier, or sorry, not earthier smells. You'll smell developed smells. You'll smell something that does not seem like it seems like as if something got bruised. The fruit was a cherry, and now the cherry is slightly bruised and exposed to like oxygen, right? So we have an oxygen exchange in an old barrel, but not a use of smell of additional oak smell. And then in when something is aged in cement or concrete or stainless steel, it smells like, you would imagine, fresh, like as if the fruit was preserved exactly like it was picked. Oh, the idea of a frozen fruit. Not that the fruit smells frozen, but if you picked a strawberry and you froze it right away, it would taste fresh. If you picked a strawberry and you didn't freeze it right away and you dried it out, that's kind of like the difference between something that might have cement or concrete aging versus old oak. So any observations on oak of these two wines? Whew. And by the way, next time you do this, and if you have these wines open or pour event for the week, I would tell you, get the third example. So one of these, by the way, is old, larger oak. One of these is some new oak, but mostly concrete aging and like a smaller oak, older oak. And then we don't have it, but we would want to try these two with something that has like new French oak, like new barrel. Okay. So with wine number one, that's the older oak. And you can almost smell like something bruised. With wine number two, this is concrete and some small amount of what do you call it, oak? 2 to 5 year old oak, but small barrel. So you have a large, like boaty, like a huge old oak for 25, 35 years with wine number one. And then you have concrete and small used oak that really doesn't impart any flavor with wine number two. But if you notice, neither one have like a very strong oak presence. Not like a very high level of clove, vanilla, cinnamon. So next time, if you have these and after or throughout the weekend, try something comparative that has some brand new oak. Like try this next to a Cali Pinot Noir and just smell for oak use. Okay, right, so fun. Hope you guys are doing well. All right, and I'm very excited about these wines. So just drink these. These are meant to be drunk too. All right, so we're revisiting. Because this is a class on earthy characteristics, we're revisiting how we get earth in our wines. So we talked a little bit about this last week, but we didn't have all of the technical parts. So these are all the earthy smells. Brettanomyces, it's a yeast. It's naturally occurring, frequently in a winery. Individuals' tolerance and taste for Brett, highly subjective. So I might think something is delicious and earthy and funky and weird, and I love it. And it's too much for someone else. But it's inherent that old world wines have a lot more of these regions that are stylistic for Brett. So some of the ones that you would imagine are the ones where you think about old wineries. Maybe the winery is not modern and it's not the picture perfect barrel chais that you see in Bordeaux houses. So we think about the Loire Valley in France, regions like Chinon, regions like Bourgogne that have these kind of old world charm, earthier cellars. If it's a yeast and the yeast multiply, then you can imagine once you get it in a winery, it's very hard to get rid of it. So Brettanomyces is able to survive in anaerobic environments, so they can infect the barrels, they can infect the entire winery, and once it's there, it's really hard to get rid of it. So when you have new oak barrels, Brett loves this high level of celobios, so the vanilla kind of it thrives with elevated levels of toast, but it also can be really multiply. It can really multiply with improperly cleaned older oak barrels. So really, it's not a question of whether or not you use new oak, will you get more Brett. It's really sometimes from new oak and sometimes from older oak that you get Brettanomyces. But really, you don't talk about it in white wines. Really, not a lot of rosés, not a lot of orange wine. It's really for barrel aged reds that you see it. Once it's in the wine, it could blossom and become more of a bad or fault aroma. So we have a couple of different types of brettanomyces. We have 4-ethyl phenol, which is 4-EP. That's kind of the bad one. It's associated with the Band-Aid aroma. And then we have the 4-ethyl glycol, which, by the way, no one's going to ask you the difference of these in the blind tasting, but it's interesting to me because often we get medicinal smells with the 4-ethyl glycol, where we get like almost like a minty smell, and then 4-ethyl catechol, which is associated with the sweaty, horsey aroma. So for me, the one that's like a fault is the Band-Aid one. That became like, I think you get that often in almost like inexperience for winemaking. So I remember for a long while, a lot of South African wines had this Band-Aid aroma. If you're a fan of Pinotage, it almost smelled like smoked, like liquid Band-Aid. I know somebody works in a hospital, they're a doctor here, but the smell of like that like really strong antiseptic. There was a problem for a long while, I think, even in Long Island wines, where a lot of them had that strong Band-Aid smell. And they were just faulty, funky, when all it does is overwhelm the wine. So that's the 4-ethyl phenol. For the glycol, you sometimes see that in Aussie wines. Australian wines definitely have a menthol and eucalyptus from the environment, but sometimes you'll get that smell with clove and really sweet. And then the 1,4-EC, the sweaty horsey, that's what I think is probably the most acceptable one. You know, the one where you get that in really great Bordeaux, you get that in Napa Cab, you get that in some, well, of course, in the Loire Valley. So, do either of these wines have brettanomyces? That's a question. Do you smell a little horsey kind of saddle smell?
Wine number 2.
Two? Yeah, definitely two.
Why it's in the tasting. Yes. So it doesn't have to be a fault. This is not a fault. This is character. So I used to tell people when Brett exists like this, it's as if like I had a little bump on my nose, like just a little that you remembered my face because it had a little more character, but not enough that you were like, all I could do is stare at this bump on your nose. So if this is a flaw, a fault, supposedly, but you know, you can imagine if ever you're trying to think about whether a wine has Brett, imagine the best Belgian beer you've ever had. Doesn't this smell a little bit like, in that regard, not the whole wine, but doesn't it smell a little bit like a Chimay or one of those like Trappist ales? Remember that smell of Brettanomyces yeast is responsible for those really great beers. You know, by the way, I used to hate beer, and I remember the first beers I liked were beers that had Brett. I loved Trappist, you know, ales, and then of course I started liking more hoppy and like more like IPAs and all those kind of things. But I remember I used to say I like beer that drinks like wine, and this is a common thread. I do have a brewery on Shelter Island where I live that the beers are so bad, by the way, horrible, because the Brettanomyces is literally taking over the wine or the brewery. And their beers are just faulted. They're dirty beers. One day I'm going to take it over and try to fix the Brett problem. But let's go back to earthy smells. So there's an earthy smell, which is called geosmin. It's an organic compound that's notably earthy in smell. It's produced by bacteria, and it's actually a component in the smell of wet rock after the rain, when those compounds are volatilized into the air. So transmission of geosmin in wine is likely the result of the compounds being directly deposited on the skins of the grapes rather than being transmitted through the vine. So it's actually interesting, but you know, the smell of like real just like rock or mineral. So let's just smell these two wines and see if we see anything like that reminds us of a wet rock. Remember when we're talking about earthy smells, we often ask you, organic earth versus inorganic earth. So geosmin is an inorganic earth, and brettanomyces is an organic earthy smell.
Oh, number 2 is organic, definitely.
Yeah, number 2 is definitely organic earth. And number 1, it has a little more like more stone, although stone and mineral, it can still smell. What I always ask you to do with earth, because it's much simpler, is to think about whether it smells white, red, or sorry, we will say like a white and gray smell, a black smell, or a red smell. So as it relates to earth, imagine with these 2 wines, we're going into the vineyard, but we're not actually there, of course, and we're thinking, what does the soil look like? And I'm going to ask you to pick one of these. Both of these have like a color soil. So with wine number 1, is the soil color red, primarily gray, or primarily black? And with wine number 2, is the soil color more white, black, or red? It's interesting. You can think about wine and descriptors. I mean, this is not technical. This is not MS stuff. This is more romance and wine writing. But I think of color when I think of wine sometimes, and shape. So what is the color of wine 1 as it relates to earth?
I get kind of like a clay pot aroma. So for me, it's red.
Yes, 100%. It is absolutely. It reminds me of the smell of a terracotta pot. So that's great. It is. It's like this sort of warm red clay soil. Like, I hate to say, like, it doesn't smell like Play-Doh, but yeah, it has that clay smell. I love that. Okay, and with wine 2, what's the difference there?
No, it's definitely black soil, very heavy. Can almost taste the roots. Smell it.
Absolutely. So yeah, so we have organic and inorganic. With wine 2, you get the ability to smell the funk and the earth and the roots and the mulch, but you also get that black rock. Like there's a topsoil, right? You can imagine there's a soil underneath that has like that mulchy kind of organic stuff, but on top there's like the crumbly black rock. So good. I loved it. This is why I wanted 2 reds for the last class, because really comparing the 2 is so much more helpful than just tasting the wines on their own. Okay, another smell that sometimes, which I'm obsessed with lately, I think this is very cool when I figured this out, the sulfur compounds. Sometimes we get this smell that smells like a mineral in white wines more than reds, and it's sulfur. So you probably had some white Burgundy that has the smell of like matchstick. In small amounts, it'll smell like really strong minerals. When it becomes extreme, that's when you get it as a flaw and it smells like rotten eggs or rotten vegetable cauliflower and things like that. But sulfur is the most pungent aroma, which results from hydrogen sulfide. Yeast naturally generate hydrogen sulfide from their sulfur-containing amino acids. So you'll always get that in a fermenting must. A lot of times people associated that flinty, smoky mineral smell with only with Old World, which you get that from other things. But a lot of winemakers have figured out how to make this kind of like mineral smell by adjusting and manipulating the fermenting must. So at any rate, bâtonnage, which is the stirring of the lees, and racking, where you take the wine from a tank and you, kind of pump it to a new fresh tank, will remove some of the sulfate and that smell. But if you want to keep that smell in a small amount to make it smell more minerals, it's a characteristic that we see a lot of the great Chardonnay vineyards of the world. So, for example, there's a Chardonnay from the Old World, the New World, from Margaret River. If you like Aussie Shiraz, or spazzing out, Aussie Chardonnay, there's one called Vas Felix, and they make a Chardonnay that you'd swear was white Burgundy because it has this mineral smell from sulfur. And they're actually just not racking it and doing this like method where it tricks you. You can almost find that it smells like white Burgundy, but the thing that's interesting about blind tasting is that the mouth has a little bit too much ripe fruit. So just because you got a mineral smell, it could be because the winemaker figured out how to use sulfur compounds to give you a little more of that, you know, sort of false positive minerality. So anyway, of course, when it becomes extreme, there's the onion, there's the unpleasant smell, but for the most part, a little minerality come from sulfur compounds is not a bad thing. Okay, I want you to smell and remember this volatile acidity. This can smell high tone, can smell like earth, and smell like between your nose, you can feel this. So acidic acid bacteria, when it converts glucose and ethanol, it makes acidic acid. And essentially these organisms spoil wine by turning it into vinegar. However, a small amount of volatile acidity we associate with Italian wine. Often you'll get VA when you make wine in large vats. So when you have this happening in mass, sometimes you'll get this smell of volatile acidity, and it prefers sugar-rich environments too. So there's certain wines that have a lot of sugar. For example, Amarone, when you use dry grapes, and you get a concentrated dry raisin grape, you can get high amounts of VA or volatile acidity. So which one of these wines has VA? Smell these wines and think about not spoiling vinegar, but thinking about like a really great balsamic.
Number 2.
Number 2, let me see.
I actually thought I got balsamic on 1.
Yeah, there's a little more as well, but I think for wine 1, you get more of the smell here in your nose. Like in addition to having the alcohol, you also have volatile acidity. So you kind of have like that smell of a little bit like a varnish or slightly like a fresh vinegar. Okay, so with that, I want to go back to our wine. So when you get the slides, remember last time I gave you the classic grapes. I gave you a bunch of them defined with the sight, the nose, and the palate structure. I just went ahead on this slide and put some of the other grapes that weren't on last week's here. So I'm not going to redo them, but the one I did want to talk about is the markers for Tempranillo, just because I don't believe we've talked too much about this yet. So I just put a couple of other ones for you to review on your own. But Tempranillo is an interesting one. Usually when we get Tempranillo, we blind taste mostly Rioja or Ribera del Duero. And when we do, we have a site that's ruby and moderate to concentrated, more like in between thin skin and thick skin grape, not necessarily a dark opaque, but not as light as like a Pinot Noir from Cali or something. The nose is actually really confusing if you're not paying attention because it has both the ability to feel sweet and tart, very similar to the smell of sweet and tart in Zinfandel, where you get a dried plum and maybe like a dried cherry, a sour cherry. Usually you're going to see a lot of oxidation and smell a lot of oxidation. So seeing it in the color, generally, you know, the great Grand Reservas have to age for 5 years. The Reservas for 3. So you're starting off before releasing the wines with development and smell. So you have to remember the theory when you're thinking about blind tasting Rioja. I put it in here because there's a significant amount of the brettanomyces, that yeasty smell of funk that you get in good Rioja from the Gran Reserva styles. But really what I think is signature is the red and dried flowers, the tobacco. Again, the red clay, the smell of dill, the smell of sweet and sour sauce, iodine, like blood, almost like a copper penny. But the palate should always steer you to Rioja because the palate has a medium plus body, but totally dry. The acid is moderate, and the tannins are about moderate as well. So you have this anomaly in the medium plus bodied old world wine, but moderate acid and moderate tannin, you know? What is key is that it's one of the few old world wines that uses American oak. And when you get the smell in Rioja and Gran Rioja, you start to see cumin, curry, fenugreek, sandalwood. So those are all characteristics of Sotalon from last week. Remember, we were talking about these smells of like Sotalon, curry, fenugreek, sandalwood. So I wanted to bring that up. But now we're going to go through our wines in their entirety and see if some things that we smelled we thought changed as we were doing the relays. We might not have noticed how extreme the structure was. So perhaps you even have a better idea. One grape that we also should review is the Nebbiolo grape, which is, you know, the typical Barolo wines, ruby garnet, significant rim variation. I think the key for me for Nebbiolo is roses, tar, a lot of tar, some truffle and mushroom, of course, the color being significantly garnet, and dried fruit, but also tart fruit. So not that different than Tempranillo in that regard. The oak is not new. The oak is usually older. The tannin is high tannin and high acid and high alcohol. Palate totally dry and anywhere from medium to full body. The body is definitely elevated by the structure. So it feels light and delicate and almost soft. And then there's like this heavy structure around it. So almost like Pinot Noir. I always say Nebbiolo is like Pinot Noir with tannin. Lots of Pinot Noir aroma, lots of Pinot Noir color, but absolutely opposite in structure of Pinot Noir. I put this up here too because I love blind tasting Amarone, and I don't think enough of us do, so we should definitely do this more often. Blind tasting Amarone is when you'll feel significant volatile acidity, that smell of possible botrytis in red wine. It's one of the few red wines that might have a little botrytis smell, but really this element of almost smells like port. It's ripe, it's syrupy, it's prunes, it's dried raisins, but then it's got all this like tobacco and ash and lamb and game. So anyway, have fun with reading these. I'm not going to read you every single one of them. There's Cabernet, but let's go through and smell and do our first wine. Well, would anyone, because we've already started the site, would anybody like to do this, the entire site for the group with wine number one? I think we mentioned a lot of it, so it's just really recapping it all in 7 seconds. Being up,
I can do it if nobody else wants to.
here you go.
So I think it's a clear red wine, pale garnet all the way through. There isn't any evidence of gas or sediment, and viscosity is medium at best, I'd say. Medium minus.
I would take the viscosity up to medium plus. I think sometimes when you have a really clean glass, which I know a lot of times I do at Cork Buzz, I can't see all of the viscosity, but the viscosity is like medium plus. Sometimes like it depends. You might not be able to see it if you clean your glasses really well. Sometimes that'll just float right off. But I would agree. So when you think about the color of this, remember this color. This is like a neon traffic cone orange. So very much like we talked about in the beginning, where the site looks old, but the moment you smell it, you know you're not drinking, a 15 or 20-year-old wine. So in terms of the nose, would anyone like to walk us through the rest of the nose and use the grid for the nose? We talked a lot about these things, so it's going to be simpler, but really just summarizing.
I can keep going again if nobody else wants to.
Do, because sometimes it's just getting people just like are hesitant in the beginning. So do.
I didn't get any flaws on the nose. Medium plus intensity. Lots of red fruit, cranberry, strawberry, cherry. The fruit to me smells slightly underripe. I get a good amount of red florals, rose petals, that clay pot that we talked about, some leather. And to me, it smells youthful. And I said used oak or mixed use.
Great. So let's go back. And now that we have all of this dynamic vocabulary, we'll add on to all of the things you said so perfectly. So we don't have flaws, but we know we have a little bit of VA. It's perfectly acceptable when you're smelling and tasting a wine like this, or when you're writing tasting notes for a website or something, to just say, it's high tone. High tone to me is when you smell something like upper, kind of upper nasal area. But in between us, of course, it has VA. And yeah, the intensity it's moderate plus, because like every time you go back, you smell something that you didn't even think you had, right? What I love is that you were talking about this red fruit and you were saying some strawberry, cherry, cranberry, but they're all tart. There's an element, if you had a bowl of fruit and all the fruit was tart, that there might be one or two like raisins somehow, right? So this is a grape that ripens slightly uneven. So while primary, you get almost like a raspberry powder. Do you remember like sweet tarts? And do you remember like almost like a Flintstone cherry vitamin? There's like this almost sour powdered red fruit. So for sure. And then if you had a whole bowl of fruit, maybe one fruit in the entire bowl of cherries was a slightly dried, but it's primarily sour fruit. All of those florals, remember, those are terpenes. I'm not asking you, I mean, you said it perfectly for blind tasting. You shouldn't use the technical words, but I'm just trying to summarize all of our lessons. So terpenic, the flowers, but the important thing is the flowers are dried. So it's like a potpourri or a dried rose petal, right? Okay, and then you get a slightly tangy green herb too, almost as if you had not pyrazine, definitely not green bell pepper, no dill, but you have like that thing that we were talking about, rotundum, where you get a little bit of like a savory marjoram or slightly green herb. All the clay pots, all the truffle, all the red earth, and then the oak is used. And yeah, relatively speaking, the wine smells relatively youthful. So you could almost settle on some age, some age being probably 5 years is like a good starting point, but not really 10 years. Like the 5-year mark, we're in 2021. So the 5-year mark, as you can imagine, let's call it 2020 for argument's sake, because 2021 is not even released. So the 5-year mark of 2015 sounds like a good vintage to start. And as we start to think about that 2015, it has some age, but it's not old by any means. So, okay. And because you did such a great job, do you want to take us through the palate as well?
Yeah, sure. So I called a good amount of, the same things, like the palate definitely reflected the nose. Again, with the red fruits. Now that you're calling that raisinated note, I definitely think I get that too. So I get the combination of the tart underripe red fruits, but I also get some slight raisinated flavors.
Yeah.
And definitely a lot of rose petals again. And they're dried, potpourri. A lot of floral actually on the palate, I think. And again, that leathery maybe anise, and some tar.
Yeah, menthol too, right?
Yes, yeah, there's like this herbal quality I couldn't quite explain.
Yeah, sweet menthol. I love that. And then, okay, so we did our structure, but just to summarize, you're in a bone dry red wine. What's your body like? How much is the mouth filled? And it's a confusing body too, right? The body is like angular. We know big body, but we don't necessarily always have to have big, heavy. The body is what? It's interesting because we think we have medium plus alcohol, we have high tannin, we have high acid, but body somehow.
I'd say medium.
Yeah, I would say that's fair. It's so interesting. Like, try to make a shape, try to describe the shape of this wine, and it'd be like some kind of triangle because it's so angular and structured and chiseled, but yet somehow like feels light. Not light. Light is, I mean, light, not light bodied, but light compared to all this big structure, which is very, very much why it is what it is. I love that. Okay, folks, old world or new world?
Old.
You have to go old, right? We're talking about old. Climate's probably moderate, not cold, not warm. Possible grapes. What kind of grapes are you thinking of? You're probably thinking of two.
Nebbiolo, Sangiovese.
Yeah, and those are the two that often get confused with each other. So we think it's Italian, right? Color screams Italian. It's orange. It's garnet. Okay, those are two grapes: Sangiovese and Brunello di Montalcino, and Chianti, and Nebbiolo and Barolo Barbaresco. Of course, we can always confuse those two. Master sommelier exams, the amount of people that call one versus the other, and this is my marker. This is what I would ask you to think about. If you're thinking that this is Sangiovese, Chianti, or Brunello, it wouldn't be a bad call. If you're thinking that this is Barolo or Barbaresco, it wouldn't be a bad call. There's a few markers for both. Number one, I always say this. Yes, we know they're Italian. Okay, we can summarize. But if it drinks like a Bordeaux, without new French oak, then it's Brunello or Sangiovese. If it drinks like a great red Burgundy with tannin and no new oak, then it's Barolo. So we're in a room and I say to you, smell this wine. Does it smell like Burgundy or does it smell like Bordeaux? What do you say to me?
Burgundy.
And you're not allowed to taste. We ask you to smell. You're calling this wine Burgundy. You're not calling this wine Bordeaux without oak. That's my marker. Now, some people will tell you, yes, you know, Brunello has more black fruit. Brunello has more savory herbs. All of that is true. But if I handed you this glass and said, you can't taste it, is it Burgundy or Bordeaux? You would absolutely say Burgundy. And that's why it's Barolo. So, I love this wine. I think it's delicious. Okay, so let's do the same with wine two. Would anyone like to do this side on wine two? And then we'll reveal both. Sight, nose, palate. We can have one volunteer. I love it because I don't think everybody wants to hear me just the whole time. I already helped you with the relay races. So, okay, we have a lot we've said already. Does anyone, Kelly, do you want to do it?
I'll do it if nobody else wants to do it. I don't know this one. I was way more sure of the first one, so.
Good. All right. Yeah.
All right, so starting back from the beginning, it's an opaque red wine. It's in the ruby to purple department. It's got no evidence of gas or sediment. Viscosity. I actually get a little bit of staining on this. Did anybody else get that?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, I got that as well.
Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, it's got some deep color to it. Medium plus?
Yep.
On the viscosity.
Okay.
So the nose was difficult for me on this, and I've been sipping it, obviously. But the first thing I got was like a ton of barnyard, which I love. But it made it hard to kind of pick out some of the things that were underneath it. The intensity, definitely medium plus. Initially, I got red and black fruit, more black fruit than red.
Mhm.
Underripe to ripe, different things going on in it. I did get a floral quality to it.
What color are the flowers? Red, purple, or white? Probably like violets, right?
I'm going with purple.
Yeah, a little more purple.
Lavender and violet are difficult for me, even though they're two very different flowers.
No, in wine, I don't think you have to tell the difference. I mean, most of the time they're you can say either. But yeah, I love that. Like the fruit. Okay, so the red fruit is tart, the black fruit is perfectly ripe. So we'll have the black cherry, we'll have the black plum, we'll have the red plum skin.
There's a lot of plum going on in it. And again, this happens to me all the time. When I first just smelled it without having tasted it, I got a little bit riper, I got a little bit blacker. When I tasted it, it surprised me.
It goes sour, a little more
I
sour.
went to a different climate based on taste. And I feel like it's just like needing that acidity to kick in, maybe, where it's like, oh, this is more red fruit. Like,
The interesting thing is it's you're right, it's normally a cool climate, but it's a slightly warmer vintage, which is why you're getting a
this
discount.
is a really confusing wine.
Well, that's good. You know,
Because
whenever something smells like this intense on the nose, where you get all this earth and funk and wild and gamey, you almost have to imagine. My friend Tim Gazer used to say this: picking up the smell that's most intense, putting it on
putting it away. Mhm.
the smell. So you're right that at first you can't get past the barnyard and the green. There's definitely an element of
So
pure.
there is an element of green to this, and that's also confusing me because the thing I wanted to say may not be the thing that it is.
Well,
Also, the thing I wanted to say doesn't really make sense based on what you already sent us.
but it does smell like bell pepper. So it has.
So I do get some pyrazine on it. I get some green. Initially it was stemmy, but I actually get a little bit of up higher. So there is some pepper on it.
Yep.
That takes us to a certain category of grapes.
Yeah.
Cayenne.
It smells like red and green bell pepper, and it's a cayenne smell and a funk smell as well. Very good.
Mhm.
I mean, you're doing.
And I do also get I got initially some dust and some leather, which was taking me to Italy, which is why I don't think you sent us to Italians. And now this is taking me to France.
Right.
But there's an outside chance that this is some new world producer, because I also get a little bit of elevated alcohol on it.
Well, try not to focus on the.
Technically, this would be old world.
Here's the deal. Whenever you're struggling with, this is the most important thing. Whenever you're
Struggling.
go back to the grid more than ever. So don't even think about conclusion, any of you. Whenever you're struggling with conclusion, forget that that box is on the sheet and just go, what is the wine telling me? I don't have to guess what it is. The wine is saying this to me. I have Brett. I have pyrazine. I have some used oak. I have red fruit. Now I need to check in on tannin. My tannin is moderate. My body is,
Medium.
my alcohol, okay, maybe it's a little bit higher, but it's not high.
Mhm.
So what wines have this much funk and green? Well, what regions are not using new oak? But tannin, not being that high, it can't be Cabernet Sauvignon blend. So what is the grape that has a softer tannin but also has pyrazine?
Cabernet Franc.
Cabernet Franc is the ultimate answer. So before you get the bell pepper, Loire, Cabernet Franc, yep, absolutely, everyone. So Cabernet Franc, Loire Valley, moderate climate, tannins make sense. You know, basically 3 to 5, very, you know, younger. And so the region, Chinon, and the area of Loire Valley. And, you know, this is like Bordeaux without the oak. That's another thing. Bordeaux without the oak. Bordeaux without the oak. So you almost want it to be Bordeaux. It doesn't have the tannin. It doesn't have the oak. So here we go. These are our wines for today. The Barolo is wine number 1 is Fratelli Alessandria. I'm obsessed. This is my favorite new Barolo. It's from a little commune in Barolo called Verduno, which is not far from La Mora. It's in the northern edge of the commune. Was a winery. I don't think it's on everybody's radar, but it should be. The alcohol is quite high. It's for, you know, a lot of times in Barolo we're going 14.5%. And 25-year-old vines, 3 years in Slovenian and French oak, but large Voti, very old. And with wine number 2, we have Bernard Baudry, Les Clos Guyot, 18 Chinon. So it's a single site. This is the site. It's like higher elevation in Chinon. It's limestone soil. 2 weeks of fermenting in cement, then 12 months in oak, but the oak is 2 to 5-year-old barrels. So they're small, but they're not new. And then it goes back in cement. All right. Q&A, questions, my dear friends. Let's see. Any tips for distinguishing between Barolo and Barbaresco? To me, it seemed like more like a Barbaresco because it didn't have the heft of Barolo that I'm used to. The 18 is a warmer vintage on the Chinon. It was like a great, magnificent vintage. So that's perhaps why we're getting some of the like warmth, even though it tasted a little bit sour. In terms of Barolo Barbaresco, it's slightly harder because there's so many different communes and styles of Barolo and Barbaresco. I agree that it's like very elegant and chiseled, and some people say Barbaresco is like more of the queen and Barolo is the king, and this is like definitely on the chiseled, like elegant side of Barolo. But I think, you know, ultimately this is Barolo because the tannins are really, really high, and this is Barolo because of the soil. And remember, there's a lot of overlap. I probably just the depth, the deepness of the how intense it is might make me go Barolo. But I would probably say like Verduno is closer in style to Barbaresco. So I don't think you would get points off for calling this Barbaresco. And then, our favorite food and wine pairing. Crystal says, and also that was MJ's thing. Gosh, guys, this is like a dream come true for food and wine pairing. First of all, Barolo is an assault on the palate, very hard to drink without food. I think we're all used to thinking about these kind of wines as they have to go with meat because they have high tannin, but we really need salt and fat. So you tell me where we get salt and fat at its finest, and that's generally cheese. And I would also argue that you can have a pasta with olive oil, a stuffed pasta with olive oil and like butter. And of course, if you're drinking local, you can have like something like what the people in Piedmont would eat, like a poutine, like a sausage type of pasta inside, like a stuffed pasta. With just like a butter and sage, truffles, of course. But, you know, you don't have to just do that. I would say, you know, anytime you're applying yourself a Barolo without food, grab some ricotta, some good olive oil, some bread. Pork in Barbaresco is really good. So porchetta, you know, you get a nice cut of like pork belly and so and have it with Barolo. Yeah, that's what I would have. I would really just make a bucatini alla matriciana with some guanciale pasta with pork or carbonara, you know, something like
Yeah.
cream and butter and heavy dish with that. So that could work. As far as Cab Franc, you know, I love Cab Franc with lamb. So Chinon with lamb. I like, you know, I love this. So if you were making like a taco night and you had some like, you know, steak, peppers. I had sausage and peppers the other night I made with like a tomato-based sausage and peppers. So I think that would be really nice with the Chinon. And that's my story for tonight. I think you're a great group. You know, you all have so much passion for wine and food. I'll send you the recap tomorrow and the video. We'll do another series when I'm back from my maternity leave soon. But it's exciting. And with me, I'm sure that there'll be tons of wine classes besides that. But if I'm going to send you an email if you're interested in starting a little virtual tasting group, I'll ask your guys' permission to share your info with the rest of you. And maybe you wanna once a month have a blind tasting or do something. Certainly Cork-wise is warmer weather. Our cafe will be open, or sorry, like outdoor dining soon enough. So if you're in New York, but if you want, we can always curate some wine tasting for you. So if you start a tasting group with your friends, if you wanna all just have one bottle of wine sent to you a month and you taste the same wines and do some, I mean, I'm sure some of you could facilitate a class like this for your friends. So keep us in mind, let us know how we can help you. And we will definitely be in touch and look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Thanks so much, Laura.
Thank you. Okay, take care, guys.